I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I have been looking forward to this conversation for weeks and weeks and weeks. Actually, in fact, since I heard this book was coming. Someone Like Us is Dinaw Mengestu's fourth novel. I have been reading him since the first book, which I thought was 2005, apparently was 2007, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears. And how does a guy from Peoria write so beautifully about DC and Paris and Addis Ababa, among other places? But how are you?
Hi, Miwa. It's great to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's so good to see your face. And I realize you're in France right now and time differences and all of that. But I have to say, like, sometimes this whole, technological, we get to do stuff on screens thing really does work. But, part of why I opened with Peoria, too, is all these years later, you have lived in the States since 1980, since you were 2, and I still see you described as an Ethiopian writer. And I'm just like, but he's a guy from Illinois.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I remember when my first book came out and I went to a bookstore and I was really excited to see my book on a shelf and then I couldn't find it. And I thought, oh, I guess they just didn't carry it. And one of my friends actually went and asked if they had it, and they said, yeah, it's in the African lit section. And I thought of that book as like being a book that's entirely in America, entirely in Washington, D.C. Really very, maybe like 5-10 passages happen outside of the country. And so, the categorization of you and your work based on where you're born or where somebody thinks you might feel most closely aligned, it obviously misses something, right? Because the work is obviously very vested in America and what's happened in America and what's happening in America right now. Even as it looks outwards and thinks about our relationship as a country to other parts of the world, Ethiopia, other parts of Africa and Europe. But it's kind of the space in which it begins. And I guess oftentimes even the literary conversations that it's having, they exist in this culture, in the United States, by and large.
Beautiful Things to me belongs on the shelf right next to Edward P. Jones's short story collections, right? And I think of Lost in the City and All Aunt Hagar's Children as sort of quintessential DC collections. And I always thought of Beautiful Things as a DC novel. I mean, you're catching it right as Square is starting to really gentrify. And, anyone who's spent time in DC, like the landscape has so radically changed between the early aughts and now. It's almost unrecognizable.
Yeah. And it's funny, when I was actually writing, I'd almost finished the first draft of the story, and a friend gave me a copy of Lost in the City. And I remember the first time I read The Store, which is set in this small little store in Washington, D.C. And it's a story that I absolutely love and that I teach and that I've read, at this point, God knows how many times. And I remember feeling just like, oh, no, like this is already done and done so perfectly. Just already this incredible story that is, set entirely inside of this small store in Washington, D.C. But in setting it in that space, Jones does this magical thing of capturing an entire man's life, but also this entire community, and the way the community's relationship to this space is so essential to understanding how people live. And if I had read that, I think before I started writing The Beautiful Things, I don't think I would have written that novel. I think I probably would have said enough. He's already done it. So fortunately, I read it after the book was pretty much finished. But yeah, I think of it as deeply, it couldn't have existed outside of DC.
Right.
I couldn't have written it had I not, been living in DC at the time, and had family not lived there for a while.
Part of why I'm starting with Beautiful Things is not just because it's your debut, and also the show didn't exist when it came out. So I'm making up for a little bit of lost time. But, and you confirmed this for me before we started taping, but there's a character from Beautiful Things who pops in the new novel in a slightly unexpected way. And I did yell a little bit. I was like, really? Is this the same Steffa? Is this the same guy? And I'm not giving anything away to folks by letting you know that he's there, but it's a treat. If you have read the first novel, it's kind of a lovely moment to have, because we're back in DC, but you've added Paris to the mix and Chicago.
Yeah. And I was, as I was mentioning earlier, the reemergence of that character was both a kind of just a real wonderful surprise. I remember after I finished that book, by one of my very first readings, a little kid came up to me and he asked me, because the character in the novel, Seifa, he owns a little grocery store, and the kid who came up to me asked me if I still had the grocery store. And I was so moved by that idea that the character kind of lives in a certain way. And I always thought, whatever happened to him, what happened to his store? And there's a kind of uncertainty about where his future lies when the book ends. And then to see him kind of emerge in this novel as an older man after clearly having done other things, felt like these worlds were kind of really in conversation and connecting in a way that I was both really surprised and also kind of grateful for. I was really, and it also cemented the book's relationship with DC as this sort of cultural political space that has changed dramatically, and also within that immigrant community that's there, and the beautiful things is said, it's like that first group of sort of migrants who are arriving in the US in the 80s. They're centered in the city, but then over the course of that generation, there's this expansion outwards, right? There's a move into the suburbs. There's this sort of like burgeoning and transformation of the DC suburbs into what we know them to be today. And the book having a conversation not only with the characters, but with the transformation of that geographic space and with the kind of enlarging sense of like how these communities have changed the city, right? It's not only that they've grown, but that they've literally transformed the demographic and the cultural and the kind of physical spaces around them over time was ended up being, kind of a real key part of how the novel evolved.
And I really love this focus on the evolution of immigrant community stories, because first gen to second gen to third gen to fourth, it's wild. And it's not just necessarily the Americanization of subsequent generations. It's also where they're pulling, like if you look at kids from Queens, right? And they just pull from all of these different communities and all of these different cultures and all of these different kinds of art. And really it's hip hop that really unites them. And so watching them move in that world is it's so fun. It really is so fun. And Someone Like Us feels a little bit like your Austerlitz, that Seybold novel. I mean, it's partially because there are photographs. There's a character who's a photographer. They are dropped in sort of intermittently. There's a little bit of your story here, but it's not autofiction. Like this is not, thinly veiled memoir. It's not that at all. But there are bits of your biography, let's say, in there.
Yeah.
And one of the first things I wanted to ask you about those, you've said, like, the way sort of Paris handles the immigrant experience and talks about it, like just Paris as sort of an entity, right? I kind of wanted to start there because I thought it was really fascinating that that's where we open with this novel.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and it's a question that I think it's an answer that I guess I'm going to continue having to formulate even as I talk about the book more. As you mentioned, right, this is a book that, like, the narrator is American born. He's that generation that feels entirely American, but at the same time is also looking out at that sort of, at the generation that came before him, right, at his mother, at his father, at the family and the community that have raised him, and understanding that there's a significant divide that separates them, that he lives and moves through the world in a way that they can't. And that also allows him to leave, and that allows him to kind of like move outside of the US and think about the role of migration and in a kind of larger global context. And Paris is one of the places in which he moves and kind of like, settles and tries to create almost like a new immigrant life, but as an American, which is a very different type of migration. And that part of, the narrative certainly mirrors my own, where I lived in France for a number of years. My wife is French, and I got to see the city in a very particular way, where I was living in a very immigrant heavy community, and I saw things that echoed and resonated very much with also how I think about the way people move through communities in America, right? And one of the things that I kept returning to is just the challenges of feeling safe, right? How hard it actually is for people to feel like once they're inside of a country, even if they have every reason and right to be there, there's a particular kind of vulnerability that the character is attuned to. And it's a vulnerability that he himself doesn't really experience. He doesn't experience it in America because he's American. And even when he travels outside of the US, he still continues to be American. And there's a privilege that comes with that. But he is, I think, allowed to witness the challenges that others like him, but who are not him, face in those realities. So in France, it's watching what happens when, there are raids that happen inside of a community, and watching the things that are left behind when those raids happen, right? So people are sort of displaced inside of their inside of a market space. But even as they are forced to kind of flee, there are traces left behind. There's a sense in which like an emptiness has been caused, and he's attuned to that, and he's trying to think about, well, what are the responsibilities that he has, right? As somebody who's both conscious of the emptying out that can happen, but also somebody who's not susceptible to that, right? He's not vulnerable in the same way that his mother might be, or in the same way these immigrant communities in France are. But he also knows that he's very attuned to that, and so he's thinking a lot about like what is his role and relationship to that vulnerability, given that it's something that he can witness and see, but doesn't necessarily experience the same way, partly because of the privilege of his birth.
And also, I mean, he's a journalist who may be leaving the profession. It seems like he hasn't quite decided if he's going to stay or leave, because again, there's this expectation outside of communities that you're going to be representative of not only the immigrant experience, but a very specific kind of immigrant experience. And, certainly I'm treading slightly gently here because watching Mamouche figure out his relationship with the truth and his relationship with people is a delight, even though there are moments where you're like, oh, guy, what are you, oh, okay, you're going to do that. I got very attached to him very quickly. And his relationship with the truth isn't necessarily as loose as, say, Jonas's from the second novel, from How to Read the Air. I mean, Jonas is really flexible with the truth. But Mamouche, I kept making notes like he's high here, isn't he? He's high. Like he's high a lot. He's on pills. He's not fully there. And I can't really remember the last time I met a guy like him in a novel like this. And I'm hoping you'll talk about sort of the start of Mamouche and his substance abuse issues.
Yeah. I think it's a lot of it is connected to that question of sort of what is sort of real, right, and what's sort of true, and what he feels like he can know. And as a journalist, or as somebody who starts life off wanting to be a journalist and thinking that he's going to be able to kind of report on events, there's an understanding, I think, that he is forced to accept that there are certain narratives that are already kind of predetermined. There are certain narrative forms and structures, the way certain types of stories are told, particularly when they come to people of color, when it comes to immigrants, when it comes to conflict zones in developing parts of the world, that he imagines that as a writer and as a journalist, he'll be able to enter into those spaces and kind of like narrate them in a different kind of way. And, I think he's forced to accept that like, that's not going to happen, right? That there is an expectation for how these stories are supposed to perform. And he does do that, right? He kind of performs it, but also he understands that so much is missing and absent in those stories, right? So if he tells and narrates the story the way his editors might want him to, that he's going to miss and lose so many other things that perhaps might be more important, right? That there are going to be enormous gaps and holes in those stories. And that, I think kind of, it alters the way I think he sees the world. He understands that any one particular narrative is not going to be able to determine what's actually sort of real, right? That the reality itself is going to be dependent upon kind of multiple kinds of telling, because to try to locate a story and to tell it once is going to be to fall into this sort of trap of telling the story, right? Whether it's the immigrant story, whether it's the story of a migrant or a Black man, whatever the case may be, how do you move away from the kind of totalizing nature of that construct? And I think he has the idea, well, these stories, it's not even that they're fungible, it's that they require and demand a kind of like varied approach in order to capture something a little bit more real. That means I have to tell you the story not just once, but like I have to tell you it again. And this telling might be a little different. And then this telling is going to be a little different. That gets back to this question of like, where that substance abuse that he faces comes from, which is connected to this sense of like, one of the characters note that there's like a hole in him, right? There's a kind of absence and a void that's sort of like fundamentally almost a part of who he is. And the substances are certainly an attempt to kind of to heal that, to kind of quiet some of that emptiness. But I think it's also that the sort of the kind of like anxiety that comes with feeling like you don't know where you belong in the world, right? Like you don't necessarily know how you fit into these sort of predetermined archetypal stories. And one way that he tries to sort of like, soothe that tension or soothe that sort of anxieties through different, through substance abuse.
And watching his wife move through, I mean, she's in Paris while he's in the US, and watching her just be very sort of matter of fact. Like, I didn't think you were coming back. I didn't know.
Yeah.
I didn't like, and again, none of those are spoilers. It's just in those moments, in that context, where she's just clearly been around him long enough to understand his patterns maybe better than he does. I mean, he lies to himself a lot. Actually, more than he lies to other people, he really lies to himself. And watching him, well, let's say, watching him miss a flight and then make choices about the next flight and how he handles that. Mamouche is really... Yeah, I wanted to hold on really tightly to him because I wanted to see where he was going to take me.
Yeah, yeah.
And I really hadn't met anyone like, because there are immigrant narratives too, where everyone's not perfect, but they're not messy. There has to be some skin in the game, right? Everyone needs to be sort of fully formed. And I feel like this guy is one of the most interesting people I've met on the page. And I read a lot, so I read a lot. And then watching him sort of connect with his mother and Samuel, who's an old family friend. And he's partially there too. He's close to Samuel, but of course they've drifted apart. And Samuel wants to create a cab company.
Mm.
And this is the best metaphor I've heard in a really long time. And I'm going to ask you to riff on Samuel's cab company and his vision for it and why it needs to exist.
I like what you said that, because I think that's sort of true. He lies more to himself than to others. And there's, he practices a type of kind of like unconscious, but yet also kind of conscious self-deception where he tries to pretend that the thing that's happening isn't actually happening. And to some degree, that's a kind of coping mechanism. He has certain, everyone has difficult things. And one of the ways we deal with some of the difficult things in our lives is either we learn how to face them and kind of address them, or sometimes we also learn bad habits, or we learn to try to pretend as if they didn't actually happen, or as if they didn't mean what they meant. And he leans a little bit more towards that other side. And so he has a tendency to kind of evade the harder truths and that might be facing him, or to kind of look at the decisions that he knows he's probably going to make. Whereas his wife is she's conscious of that, and to some degree she's trying to kind of bring him and sort of force him to reckon with like the kind of harder truths of like what actually is in front of him, right? Even if they might look at it in different ways. And to some degree that, that enigmatic quality pairs very well with Samuel, who is an enigma in his own particular way, where he's constantly telling you things about himself. He loves to talk, and there's a kind of like, at least when in writing him, I felt it was a kind of like rapturous joy. I loved what I heard his voice, because I felt like he was just going to like spill out so many different parts of him, but it didn't necessarily mean he was telling you the truth. It just meant that he liked to talk, and he liked to tell things, and he liked to kind of command and perform. But they both maintain a kind of like hidden sort of quality, which there's this essay from Flannery O'Connor where she talks about, what makes a character really interesting, right, is when we get them to a point at which we don't understand why they do what they do, to paraphrase that. And at that point that a character actually becomes most alive, because human beings are not only, complex, but they're also kind of like, there's a point in which we just can't always explain why they do what they do. And that mystery is what makes us really interesting. It can be what really makes characters really interesting. And to think about like, how do you create and get Mamouche to be both present, but also acknowledge him and Samuel's ability to be sort of fully grasped in a certain way, right? Like they do things that like they don't fully understand why they do them. The reader hopefully understands a sense of why, even if not, or how they, some of the reasons why they do that, if not all of them. That cab company that he wants to create, he has this sort of dream. It's the one dream that he really kind of like holds on to the most is this idea of creating a cab company that can get, in particular, immigrants and anybody who might feel that they can't move safely through the world back to someplace safe. So if you are outside, and comes from this experience of being picked up by the police in Washington, D.C., and realizing that like it's not sure that he will get home, that he can drive himself safely from point A to point B. And so he dreams this idea of like a cab company that will be the one that will get you from from those places. And in writing that, a lot of that certainly came from, a lot of those passages were being written post 2020, and certainly thinking about, how dangerous sometimes it can be to move through the world because of the color of your skin, because of your, a black man walking through the wrong neighborhood or through the wrong street. And then also thinking about different immigration laws that have been passed and the way those laws create a profound sort of fear in people and in their own anxiety that, maybe they should stay shuttered inside of their home because it might not be safe for them to go outside. Whether that fear is real or not doesn't really sort of matter, because there's a kind of larger cultural narrative that's being told that, these people are dangerous, that these people are criminals, that they need to be deported. And all of those stories collectively told, right, create that fear, right? It creates this anxiety that the world may be not safe for you or for people like you. And Samuel's dream, it's like a sort of pre-Uber dream, and it also made, I was thinking a lot too about like actually like the economic collapse that happened with cab drivers, right? There was a lot of cab drivers that I've known, and certainly I remember when, these, apps were coming around, and they were sort of collapsing this very essential economy for immigrants. And, that dream that he builds also, is sort of going to become victim to that as well.
You've said in other interviews that fiction fills a role in our lives that I think nothing else can. And listening to you talk about someone like us and these characters makes me so excited to know that this book is about to be out in the world. I mean, you and I are taping a couple of weeks before the official pub date of the book, so I have to be patient for other people to get their hands on it and start to engage with it. But so much of this novel happens in the gaps, right? The gaps between what Samuel knows about himself and what we know, or what he tells himself about himself, and the gaps with Mamouche and Hannah, and all of these gaps, right? The gaps between the inside and the outside, and the interior and the public, and all of it. And so you're writing in a way, I'm not even entirely sure I have the words to describe exactly what you're pulling off, because everyone's in a liminal space, even in their own bodies. I mean, there's some references to being ghostly, and certainly the comment that Hannah makes about the whole. But yeah, it's a little bit of a trick in a way, because I don't know many other writers who can do quite what you're pulling off here. So I just want to talk about craft for a second.
Yeah.
Because you're leaving a lot out, and you're actually trusting us to be able to fill in some gaps.
Yeah, and trusting not only, I think, to some degree that trust is like hoping you care enough to fill in those gaps. It's as much a question of like, have I laid out enough there? But like also, I trust the reader certainly to be intellectually capable of doing that, right? But the question is like, I'm also trusting that you have enough emotional investment to do that work. So that's like even more important, I think, to how fiction lingers and kind of like resonates. It's like the sense that I can work to understand the characters, and not because it's like hard work, right? But actually, am I going to invest enough to try to understand these characters whose lives are probably going to be fairly different from the reader? They're different from mine, certainly, right? That type of investment is I think, for me, the most kind of like ethical thing that fiction can do, and I think of that as very much a craft question. And in writing this book, it took a long time to write this one, and that span of time was partly wonderful because it kind of came along with a sort of an evolution and kind of like a lot of critical thinking about how and what my responsibilities are to the stories that I want to tell. And there's, I can't remember the name, but there's a French critic or theorist who talks about kind of the opacity of a character, the opacity in fiction, as being a really ethical thing. Because one, it doesn't determine the meaning of the character for the reader. It doesn't tell you this is what happened. It doesn't fix the character's experiences in one singular definition or understanding, which gives room for the reader to kind of create and invest their own feelings. But it also means that I'm not going to try to tell again that story as a singular experience. And that means that there's room for the characters to exist in multiple ways, right? There's room for our understanding of them to differ, for our understanding of them to be really opposed. And there also might be ways in which it kind of implicates, I thought a lot about well, how do I also implicate myself as the writer of this book, right? As someone who's consciously trying not to control the meaning of the story. And what does it mean to make that almost a part of this narrative itself? And there's a way in which writing is such a critical part of this story. It is about how stories are told and the responsibilities we have to them, and recognizing the limits of just how much and how well we can know anyone we love, and that it might be very close to us. I know people who I care about deeply and I've loved them my whole life, but because I've loved them my whole life, I also know just how impossible it is to contain their experiences in a story. And the respect for that complexity is something that you think, well, how do I put that back into the novel, right? How do I put that, it's just enormous expansiveness that comes with an individual's life into the story. And I think that, the kind of ambiguity and the opacity is one way of doing that. That liminality hopefully offers that space for both the characters and the reader.
It did for me, but you've also taught for a number of years, and I'm wondering how you teach that kind of expansive vision.
Yeah.
Especially, a lot of younger folks have come up more on screens than, say, you or I did, right? And I do think that changes the way you interact with text. I remember when Robert Coover was sort of doing the hyperlink thing, and we were all like, wow, that's the wildest thing we've ever seen, right? And you're just like, this was novelty.
Yeah.
And of course it was Robert Coover, and of course it was, I'm just kind of laughing thinking about the whole thing, because look at how far we've come since then. But how do you teach sitting in the liminal space to find the story?
Yeah.
How do you, it is tricky.
Yeah. And it's tricky partly because I think it doesn't have, whatever we might consider try to define as a craft thing, right? There's, I think it comes from kind of approach more than a set of tools that I can offer a student. And sometimes I feel I know that can be frustrating for my students who feel like they want to know what to do. And I think I'm oftentimes more interested in having them kind of step back and let them figure out what they're going to do, but to ask them to think about, well, how do they see, right? What can they consider about how they understand their characters and their relationship to the characters, and how can they kind of think about the limits of their own awareness of them. But if you can respect that limit, if you can respect the fact that as the author, the narrator, there are limitations to how well they're going to know the character, and that is a kind of necessity for that character to be alive. It doesn't mean you can't have a sense of what they would do, but it means that you have to know that there's this interior reality that's hopefully very vast, and what you're going to try to do is gesture towards it in as many different ways as possible, while also knowing that there's going to be limitations to how well you can get to them. I think that's really important. And I think a lot about the way characters see. So if two characters are looking at an object, the same exact object, they're going to notice different things. And it doesn't mean you can explain why they notice different things about it. But if you can think about the fact that they don't look at the world the same way, and that they might never look at the world the same way, it does something to respect that difference, right? Rather than trying to find a way to kind of say, well, we're all the same and we all have, which is we all have fundamental values and beliefs and love and all those things. But I also think there's something really important about the respect for some of the profound differences that shape our lives. And rather than trying to collapse those differences into kind of a familiar template, to kind of think about the sort of beauty in the distance that stands between us, right? There's something remarkable in recognizing that those gaps, as you noted.
I love that line, beauty in the distance. I may have to find a way to work that into something. There's a shelf talker there. There's something going. The gears are turning. I'm also just thinking about how a lot of communities, not necessarily just immigrant communities, but I am going to focus on immigrant communities here for a second because I can, but the idea that we're not monoliths, right?
Yeah.
Like one community isn't like there are variations of people, the way there are variations across any kind of population. There are variances through communities. And that's one of the things I love about reading your novels too, is I never quite know who I'm going to meet. And I love that. I mean, I'm just also thinking like Joe from the Congo and some of the minor characters from Beautiful Things, or well, not necessarily minor characters, but guys who make the experience a little richer. I just always feel like I'm going to be surprised by something, possibly more than one thing, when I'm reading you. And I don't necessarily know if that's how other people approach your work. I think we all agree that the sentences are gorgeous and the storytelling is top notch and all that kind of thing. But I love the idea that I can still be surprised by what on the surface could be taken as, you know, a kind of traditional story.
Yeah.
You know, woman moves into the neighborhood. Guy falls in love. You know, I'm also thinking of Isaac and Helen in a certain way and how their story gets revealed in All of the Names, which was your third novel. Do you ever have moments where you get to be surprised, or are you sort of connected to everything as you're working?
I think I'm often surprised. I'd say this book probably surprised me more. I mean, some of the biggest things that happen in the book when they it sort of feels terrible to say that and not explain what it is, but just there's, you know, this is why people hopefully will read it. Happened without my knowing they were going to happen, and when they did happen, I had, you know, one of those moments when I just kind of stopped writing, and I was like, is that possible? It felt like right, you know, it felt so much like the thing that was actually happening, but it surprised and to some degree kind of like alarmed me. You know, that feeling of like it's something involving without necessarily your total control over it, but at the same time thinking about like, is that really, can I get away with that in a certain way? Even though it felt like the only solution to this, because I felt like the narrative had gotten to a point where like I didn't know how it was going to move anymore. And when those moments happen in the novel, you know, that's when it feels really alive. It feels like the most alive because it feels like the characters are mysterious still to me, even that after 10 years with them. And, you know, and in this book, with one of the interesting things about it was actually like trying to move deeper into, you know, as you said, to figure out like actually all the different layers and nuances that exist within any community, right? And in this case, thinking about this diasporic community that's, you know, really significant, particularly in Washington, D.C., and thinking about how to unpack, because, you know, we all tell stories, right? And immigrant communities tell particular stories about themselves that they project, that they want their children to believe in. And to some degree, it was like, well, how do you complicate those both projected narratives and the narratives that are also kind of self-perpetuated? How can you show particular types of vulnerability that are oftentimes consciously masked as a kind of protective device, right? It's like you need to put the best face forward. And so how do you, you know, sort of peel some of those things back? And one of the things I kept thinking about, well, there's a certain thing that comes with, there's a type of vocabulary that became possible in America that wouldn't have existed in Ethiopia, right? There's a vocabulary to talk about addiction, for example, in a way that would be much harder to do outside of the sort of, you know, the context of the diaspora. And so that gave me to some degree a chance to kind of like let these characters roam a little bit more and let them also experience America in very different ways, right? The fact of being in that country means that they're going to have very different understandings of what that means for them and what they're doing there. And for some of them, it's a necessity. For others, it's something that they never recover from.
And generationally too, the way language shifts, right? Like it's wild watching people from different generations in a similar community and like just the slang alone, right?
Yeah.
Or, you know, emojis get thrown in, all of that kind of thing. It's just the gaps. Again, the relationships, even sort of day to day, Sunday dinner, whatever, the gaps are where the interesting stuff happens. Yeah. And there is no presumption that what's sitting there is going to be consistent across generations, across gender, across, you know, familial relationships, all of this kind of stuff. And that's, to me, sort of the great pleasure of reading all of this kind of stuff. But you're also working within a tradition, right? You've talked about Saul Bellow in the past, and I did. So I have been late to Augie March. I will own it. I've just started it, and I'm sort of reading it concurrently with a bunch of other things, which, okay, I was late to Augie. I'm just embarrassed that I was late to Augie, but I'm here now. But, there are times where the work that you do gets really fully separated from that. And I'm like, but we're talking about not dissimilar narratives, maybe stylistically, sure. But so Bellow, I mean, you grew up in Illinois. Of course, Bellow's going to be one of your guys.
Of course. I mean, yeah. And, parts of the book are set in Chicago. And, there's no way to write about Chicago and not think of Bellows at multiple points. And I can't remember which Bellows novel it is, but there's a scene in which the character is sort of having, I think it's Herzog, and the character's been sort of wandering and he's remembering, kind of entering the kitchen that his parents were in, and they're speaking Yiddish. And there's this sort of gap between what he hears and can understand in that conversation. And, something very, so, I realized almost after, much later after the book was done, there are very similar things that, like, moment that actually happens in this novel as well, where that gap between generations, right, which can play out in many different ways. It might be because, the kids today are on their phones and the other generation isn't, but also obviously through language and the fact that there's a testing of boundaries about what may or may not be understood, but also what can be shared and what can be conveyed. And certainly, he was thinking about that in that very particular context in a way that I feel very much indebted to, and that I'm considering and thinking about as well. As you look at the way, the generation before you talks and tells stories, and wondering about your capacity to both understand them on a literal sense, right? Like just as in terms of language, but also our ability to kind of really understand them just in that, like, I don't know those places, right? Like I can maybe tell you the whole story in English. My father would tell me stories of growing up in Ethiopia and in the countryside, and he'd tell the stories in English, but I didn't actually believe it was real for a long time. I was like, that's just not real. Like things like trees don't look like that, or the landscape doesn't look like that, or couldn't have been that way. And that sense of of that gap, that divide about how well we can understand, the generations that precede us, and how they transmit those things and our ability to accept them is, I think, just one fundamentally like what every generation, what any child goes through with their own parents, or what we go through with people that were close to us. But obviously, certainly something that can be sort of even more pronounced in an immigrant community, partly because of that distance, right? Because the thing that they're talking about feels like it belongs to a country far, far away. And, I think at one point the characters even, tell Mamish, like, you talk about Ethiopia as if it's a made up country. And they kind of criticize him for that, even as it's something that he tries to resist.
Samuel, too, has a relationship with books. Samuel's relationship with books, which I'm not going to spoil, but he does. Yeah. He has this idea that if he can just tell his story, right? Like he's still, there is, we still ascribe this, you must be exceptional kind of thing. And really, like, let's just live our lives and have a lovely time, right?
Yeah.
But watching Samuel sort of pick through his relationship with language, and also his relationship with Mamouche in terms of what Mamouche does for work. He's like, well, you should write this story. And he's like, well, actually, I'm not going to write that story. Yeah. And so watching that level of relationship too, I always have a really good time when characters are playing around with language and not just, sort of in conversation at the kitchen table kind of thing, but the larger conversation about who has the actual power of language, right? Who can actually use it to an end. And you referenced this earlier when you were talking about sort of what's my obligation as the narrator, what's my obligation as the teller of this story, like obligation to reader, character, all of this kind of thing. This is a slightly more playful book, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's fair to say, right? I mean, just sort of the philosophical kind of things that you're playing with, and some of the I'm also trying to not give something away. I'm trying to talk around a piece of the book that I'm pretty sure you know what I'm referencing. Was that true for you as you were writing, though? Was it? I mean, 10 years is long for you. I mean, I remember the other books coming at a sort of faster clip.
Yeah. I like that idea of the playfulness, right? There's I think it comes up once in the book where there's an expression in Amara, it's like techawit. And if you're sitting with a family member and you're just sitting quietly in silence, somebody will tell you, and it's sort of like, let's play. And it's good, and the way my uncle first defined it for me when he told me, it was like, kind of like, let's play with words, right? Like, let's talk, let's just banter. And I remember when I was, the first time I'd gone back to Ethiopia, I was in my 20s, just actually marveling over how much fun people had playing games with stories, right? Like, somebody coming out just for no random reason, bringing out a birthday cake for somebody's 80th birthday who had just turned 50. It was just like, there was just so much joy in these sort of constructed realities that people could do. And that's, part of what Samuel certainly loves, right? But he's also very aware, I think, as you note, that telling a story is power. And there's an enormous amount of power that comes with that. So even as he's very playful with it, and even as he's constantly kind of teasing, Mamush and, provoking him to, telling him what he can and can't say, what he can and can't know about the kinds of stories he would tell him to write or want him to write. There's also, inside of all of that humor, a kind of real understanding that to be able to tell a story, particularly given and knowing that your story is often told for you, is a particular power that he wishes he had, and that perhaps the narrator of the novel might have. That comes back to the sort of like implication of me as the writer. It's like, so what do you do with that? What do you do with that capacity and that sort of potential or role that you have? And it's a question that Mamush certainly tries, and that the book itself tries to kind of grapple with, like, what do you do with that? And what do you do with the fact that, like, here's someone trying to tell you something, and how do you receive that, right? Because for them, they don't have the same sort of narrative privileges that you do. And it did, I think the long span of time, a surprising amount of it was spent trying to address some of those questions and concerns, and thinking about everything that I'd written beforehand, and wanting to both kind of embrace those narratives, but also at the same time thinking about kind of some of their limitations in a certain way, and wondering about expectation, representation of what it means to be from a country like Ethiopia, what it means to be in America, what it means to be able to try to argue for both things in the same way, at the same time. All of those things are sort of like swirling in the background, while at the same time you just want to tell a story. So, yeah.
But that's the beauty of fiction, right? Like, this fiction is so flexible in ways that other art forms aren't always, and that's partially just the physicality of the form, right? Like, you can do things in a novel or a story or a novella. You can do things with time and interiority and liminal space that you can't necessarily represent well in other forms. And I'm going to include audiobooks in this because I was re-listening to all the names as I was prepping for this. And I was also curious to see how the audio was going to be presented. And, they did a nice job.
Yeah.
All props. But listening to a narrator tell me the story instead of sort of directly engaging with it as text. I'm one of those people who really, I mark up things and I dog ear, I write all over stuff. I prefer a pencil because it doesn't bleed through. Like the fact that I have opinions on what kind of pen or pencil to use in my marginalia, it's like, well, I need to be able to read it later on. Being able to engage, right, with the characters and the language and the story, and have a new understanding and experience of other people.
Yeah.
It's kind of magic.
Completely. I mean, it's like, as you said, there's so many things that you can do inside of fiction, the way you can move and bend time, and the way you can go inside of a character's head, and the way you can move out of their head. The way you can, for me, like, structure and time are really essential, right? And so I love the sort of different possibilities structurally that a novel, that fiction can offer. And to me, that is magic, right? So like, I don't, and I joke with my students sometimes, it's like, you don't necessarily need to create the fantastic in a certain way. Like, you don't necessarily need to have, the magician in order to have the magic. There's so many things that are already mysterious and actually just formally available to you, right? The way you can drop a character and jump ahead 30 years. That's magic. That's time travel, right? You don't necessarily, it's great if you have a time traveling machine. It's fantastic. Mm-hmm. No opposition to that. But you can also just do that, right? You have this capacity to do that anyway. It's there, and it's there in the service sometimes of something really fantastic, which is like the exploration of these characters and seeing them in different ways and in different lights, and moving them through the world in ways that maybe that wouldn't be possible in reality. But that also means you get to unfold them in ways that ordinary life doesn't allow. And there's this real joy in being able to see somebody in multiple lights in multiple years, and being able to allow them to see through reality that way. For me, it's like magic, and it feels sometimes like surreal when it happens.
That seems like a really great place to end, only because we're getting close to possibly revealing some stuff that you and I have agreed we do not want to reveal in this conversation. So I'm going to say thank you so much, Dinaw.
No, thank you so much, Miwa. Thank you for your support for this book. It's really wonderful, and I'm just profoundly grateful to you for that.
And I'm so excited for readers to meet Samuel and Mamouche, because I think these are the kinds of characters that tattoo themselves on the back of your brain, and you walk around with them for a really long time. And I am so excited for readers to meet them.
Thank you, Miwa. Wonderful to see you again.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.